Hey y'all, welcome to Night School. I'm Aria.
And I'm Darian.
And Night School is a program of the California Academy of Sciences Nightlife, which is an in-person program for adults that mixes science, culture, and art every Thursday night. We here are the online version. Welcome. And tonight we're celebrating all things rocks. Rock landscapes, rock fossils, rock art, rock music, not the type of rock music you're thinking of. Regrettably not rock lobsters, but that's for a different time. But rocks and geological formations can tell us a lot of stories about past life on Earth, and the shifting landscapes of the past are ultimately what really shaped life on this planet today. And geology is just kind of where it's at. We have an amazing lineup of guests today who approach geology through a bunch of different ways, through scientific collections, illustration, and geophysics. And I'm going to pass it right over to Darian to intro them.
Thank you, Aria. I am so excited for tonight's slate of guests, and that is a rock pun. So ever since I've lived in California, I've been looking everywhere for dinosaur fossils. Do you do that also? Like everywhere, under rocks, around corners, in between couch cushions, all to no avail, like nothing. But then we were planning tonight's night school. Our first guest, Cal Academy's Maricela Abarca, taught me that I'm not a bad fossil hunter. There just aren't very many dinosaur fossils found in California. Maricela will dig into why that is and what the few dinosaur fossils that can be found in California can tell us about our state's geologic history. Our next guest, Emily Underwood, is an incredibly talented illustrator and science communicator who explores the intersections of art and earth sciences in her self-produced zine, magazine. My brain wants to say zine, but it's zine, centered around the geologic. Her scene is centered around the geologic features and processes that have created California's diverse array of landscapes. She'll guide us through her process and share some of her breathtaking and educational illustrations for us to gawk at and ultimately learn from. And then lastly, we will be treated to the dulcet tunes of Riley Finnegan's rock music. And by that, we mean the sounds that come from the vibrations in Utah's natural rock arches. Vibrations too small to see with the naked eye and too slow and low to be heard with the naked ear. Riley will share how she deploys seismic sensors to record these tiny constant movements and better understand how human activity impacts the structural health of these iconic geological features. And we'll get to take a listen too, which I'm really excited about.
Absolutely. And as always, you're watching us live tonight, so let us know questions, comments, thoughts on rock music and dinosaurs in the chat. And we'll have a Q&A after every speaker. So leave those questions. We'll circle back to them in after every session. And yeah, with that, we're just going to go ahead and kick it off to Maricela.
Hi everyone, thank you Darian and Arya for the really fun introduction. I just want to tell you, Darian, it truly is not you. It's just the state of our state, being California. Actually, wait, I have a question. Is there a way for me to see my slides instead of just me? Okay. Yay! Yeah, so I'm really happy to be part of Rocktoberfest. I do love a good pun. And we're going to be talking all about the lonely dinosaurs of California. Lonely because, as our host stated earlier, there aren't a lot of dinosaur fossils found in the state. We have a lot of other really cool and unique things in the state. Like, I grew up in California. We have the ocean, we have the mountains, valleys, gold, lots of other really unique, beautiful things in the state. And I just want to know, like, where are all the dinosaur fossils? Like, where are they at? And no, it's not because California is really expensive. It's just has to do with the geologic setting during that time. And it is true that dinosaurs are cool, and even our California state legislators think so. This is a quote from a press release from a couple years ago when they were deciding on our state dinosaur. And I am sorry to report that our California state dinosaur is not either of the charismatic dinos on the slide. But if you know what it is, or if you want to take a guess, you can leave a comment. We'll see if you're right in a couple of minutes. So we just have Sue the T-Rex from the Field Museum in Chicago, and we have this lovely Triceratops from the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles, and the really beautiful specimens. And if you're wondering where a lot of the dinosaur fossils are in North America, they are here in the States with the X's through them. So the Western US is actually very well known for its prolific dinosaur material. And you'll notice that California is actually left off of the Western US in this case. And these maps will kind of show you why. So all those states with X's through them, you can see them here. And to the left, California is actually not even a terrestrial landmass in the Jurassic. It's mostly underwater still. And in the Jurassic, we have the Morrison Formation being laid down, which is very popular for its Jurassic dinosaur fossils. So things like Allosaurus are preserved well. And in those states with the X's on them from the previous slide. And if we fast forward a little bit to the late Cretaceous, it's kind of a similar story. With something of note is the Western Interior Seaway, which is forming, or it's starting to close by this time, but it extended further north earlier in the Cretaceous. So that was also very important for really exquisite dinosaur fossil preservation. It was a warm, shallow sea, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And if you zoom in on California and check in on it again, it's starting to build up a little bit more of terrestrial landmass by this time. And if you're wondering how, it's not magic. It's good old plate tectonics. And in the Mesozoic, there was a tectonic plate called the Farallon plate, and we don't have that anymore. And the reason is because it was totally buried, subducted by the North American plate. So the Farallon plate was just kind of hanging out, minding its own business during this time. And the North American plate was getting pushed further to the west because of Atlantic spreading in the east. So as it was getting pushed over the Farallon plate, because continental crust is less dense, it would stay on top, and the Farallon plate just kind of got squished underneath. Yeah, so it's another very classic earth science diagram, all about subduction, with one of my favorite geology teaching photos I think I've ever seen online. It's courtesy of the National Park Service, and they called it grocery store tectonics. And it's just your regular Diet 7-Up liter, if you drink that, and packet of Oreos. I would probably have more than one packet of Oreos, toilet paper, and fig Newtons. And as those features of the oceanic crust are getting moved along by the conveyor belts and they smash against that continental crust, you get lots of uplift. Your Oreos are perpendicular to the surface. Your Charmin toilet paper is all jumbled and facing different ways. And it's this accretion and this process that gives us a lot of what made California geology really beautiful and unique. And it's also the process that gave us the Sierra Nevada mountains. Were born in the Mesozoic era during this time because of this process as well. And I think Emily might talk a little bit later about the beautiful natural features that we get because of this. One of my favorite things is to see ribbon chert that's been deposited along the coast. This is an example of a chert formation on a beach in San Francisco, and I really like this photo because it really, you can see the movement of the rock as it got smashed up against the continental margin and then thrusted upwards. And yeah, so pillow basalt is another feature that we have because of this. Serpentinite or state rock. So these really high pressure, high heat environments were super great for making formations like this, but they're not so great for if you're trying to become a fossil. Because in order to become a fossil, you need to hang out undisturbed for a really long time and not get eaten by scavengers and not get melted and not get squished by really intense pressure of subduction and tectonics and volcanics. So it wasn't a great environment for preservation in California at that time. And then dinosaurs also just didn't have a lot of terrestrial land during that time. They had a very slim margin of continental coast to live on during that time as accretion was happening and as California was kind of being born as a terrestrial landmass. That's not to say we don't have any dinosaur fossils in California. I think what we do have is actually really special in its own way. So we're about to jump into that. And this is a silly aside. These are the Cabazon dinosaur park fossils made famous by the Pee Wee Herman movie. When I was little and I saw this movie, I thought these were giant props that they made specifically for the movie, but it turns out that it's actually a park, and you can go there and drive out to outside of Palm Springs and have your little pilgrimage to the Pee Wee Herman movie, which I actually did a couple years ago. It was really fun. So just another quirky California thing that we have here. But if you're looking for the real deal, real California dinosaur fossils, we do have those too. And this is a diagram from a publication from 2015. Some researchers laid out some of the more important and well-preserved fossils from Laramidia, which is this western island during the Cretaceous. So yeah, we see the return of the Western Interior Seaway and all of those states with X's through them from earlier. You can see that they're either underneath the seaway or on the coast of the seaway. Yeah, so being buried in a warm shallow sea is really great for preservation, and being on the coasts of these land masses are really great for preservation as well. So that's why the preservation in places like Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Colorado is really great there. But we're going to talk about some of the really unique standouts from California. One of them being the Carlsbad ankylosaur, and it was found near San Diego in the late 80s in the Point Loma Formation, which is actually really interesting because it preserves marine organisms, things like clams, oysters, scallops, marine algae. So when scientists discovered this, they were like, oh, is this a marine dinosaur? What exactly is going on here? Why are there fossil oyster shells like on this leg bone? What is going on? But upon further study of the specimen and specimens like it, actually from the Western Interior Seaway, they decided that what actually happened is that these animals were either like living next to riverbanks or on the coasts and foraging for like coastal vegetation or vegetation on the banks of rivers, and they would die and get washed out to sea, which is kind of like a whale fall now when you think about it. The animals die, sink to the bottom of the ocean, become its whole like a whole new ecosystem. It gets a second life in death almost. Became basically a reef, like an oyster reef. And they all got fossilized together at the bottom of the ocean. So it's a really interesting story. So this is the ankylosaur from Carlsbad. And the California hadrosaur is our state dinosaur, so if you guessed that, good job. It's the dinosaur that our legislator was referring to when he said dinosaurs are cool, and it follows a similar story. It was found in the Moreno Formation in Fresno, which is definitely not marine now. It's like very much a land, an area of land, but it was a marine deposit back then. And it's just a similar story of dinosaurs that were living, like near riverbanks, near bodies of water, and they would get washed out into the ocean. So both of these are examples of taphonomy, which is kind of the consideration in paleontology of the kinds of conclusions you can draw from where you find fossils and the kinds of conclusions that you can't draw from where you find fossils, and just considerations of how animals die and get preserved and things like that. So they're two really interesting stories, and these are just some examples of other marine fossils from California. Like, we are literally swimming, pun intended, in marine fossils in California. So we have ammonites from the collection, and then also plesiosaurs, also from the Moreno Formation in Fresno. And then I also brought some marine fossils from the collections here, and they're hanging out behind me. I'm happy to take any questions about anything that I just talked about, or if you have other questions about what's behind me. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned about the lonely dinosaurs of California.
Great. Thank you so much, Maricela, for teaching us all about the fossils found in our state. I had no idea that there was so much right below our feet. Or maybe not below our feet, but in the state. It was still pretty cool. We had a couple of questions in the chat about plate tectonics and how that relates to fossilization, or like the lack thereof. First and foremost, I think that explaining plate tectonics with the conveyor belt of the grocery store was genius.
Yeah. I know. I love it too. Yeah, I was kind of like, man, where was this when I was in like 7th grade?
So when a plate gets fully subducted, does it like disintegrate to like into lava? What happens to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of what happens is that the rock melts and it turns into like a different form of what it used to be before, and then it can hang out underneath for a long time. And then what happens is as what's above it starts to erode away, it starts to get uncovered again. Yeah, so that can happen. What else can happen? You can also get like magma pockets out of what was kind of like melted and transformed because of all that intense heat and pressure as well. But it definitely doesn't like disappear into nothing. Yeah, it gets transformed into something else, and then it hangs out for a long time until it rises to the surface again. Yeah.
Good to know. On kind of a similar note, Trisha wants to know if places like in the Pacific Northwest, the Cascadia fault line, are they impacted by the fault lines that we have here in California?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes. Yeah. So another kind of interesting discovery from one of the papers that I mentioned is that they just found like the first dinosaur from Washington State, and the dinosaur did not live in that area of the world in life. It actually lived somewhere in Mexico, and because of um,
It was on
the sand
vacation.
yeah, totally. It's like trying to get a tan, trying to hang out. And then it just got against its will, like moved up to the Pacific Northwest because of this new transform fault. Because the Farallon plate, when the North American plate was going towards it, they were like going like this. And then the Farallon plate disappeared. And then that's how we got the San Andreas fault started going like this. And it's moving. So the San Andreas fault started moving stuff from the south all the way to the north.
Huh. That's so interesting. That even after death, they can be moved by the fault lines.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Blair wants to know, outside of dinosaur fossils, are there any like significant areas where you can find other types of fossils in California or like microfossils?
Yeah. So chert is cool because it's a bunch of microfossils. They're little microscopic organisms called radiolaria. And there's a lot of outcrops in San Francisco. I'm trying to think, like places like Corona Heights, stuff where there's like red, orange rocks. And if you take like a powerful enough like little hand lens, like magnifying glass thing, and hold it up, you can kind of see the little remnants of their little skeletons. So that's like microfossil. But there's like a lot of different fossil deposits in California. We have a bunch of ammonite deposits in like Central California. We're like very also well known for our Ice Age mammal megafauna fossils. So I'm trying to think. In the collections here, we have some mammoth, mastodon specimens from like construction downtown in San Francisco when they're like building skyscrapers, and you come across these fossils and they end up in the collections here. Yeah, the La Brea tar pits in LA is really fun. Yeah, we have definitely, lacking in dinosaurs, but like definitely a plethora of everything else. Yeah.
Yeah, Deanna actually you almost answered their question. They wanted to know what kinds of fossils we had in our collection at the Academy, or were there any of the ones in your presentation that we have at the Academy? What does that collections look like?
I think so. Our strength in the geology department is definitely marine invertebrates, so stuff in the ocean without backbones. But we do have some cool vertebrate specimens, like those Ice Age mammals. We have the dire wolf skull. We have a really big Smilodon saber-toothed cat that's on display on the public floor now. And I actually almost forgot, but I did bring a hadrosaur tooth plate to show that I can show now. So it's one of our dinosaur fossils. We don't have a lot of dinosaur material here. But this is a tooth plate of our state dinosaur. That they have really crazy column teeth to make up for chewing on lots of vegetation. So they're just kind of like an elephant tooth, get like really worn down over time, and then have new teeth behind it waiting to come off the bench. Yeah.
Was each one of those columns an individual tooth, or was that one big tooth?
I think it's like, that's a good question. I think it's like each one is one tooth, and then they're all like conglomerated into like a plate.
Huh.
Wild. I'm not sure. I have to read a little bit more about the ecology of their teeth.
Interesting. Good opportunity to learn about our state dinosaur.
Yeah.
Orley wants to know, you mentioned the dinosaur fossil that was recently found in Washington State. Like, what's the northernmost range of these fossils? How north do they go?
Another good question, I think. So there's definitely some in like British Columbia. And I want to say I read about some in the Aleutian Islands, but I'm not sure. I'd have to like check again. So like all the way in Alaska. But I'm sure it's like a similar story where those animals were living somewhere else, and because of tectonics, those fossils are like all the way up there now.
Wow. And moving to the other side of the state, Southern California, are there any fossils from the Channel Islands or that area? What fossilization on islands, is that possible?
Yeah, that's really fun actually, because the last mammoths were like little pygmy mammoths before they went extinct. And those fossils, I'm pretty sure, are on the Channel Islands, are from the Channel Islands, and like little miniature mammoth fossils from the Channel Islands. And there's also a lot of marine stuff from the Channel Islands as well that we have in the collections here too.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for the presentation. I definitely am going to have to check out the chert next time I'm at the beach. I'll take a closer look.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Looking closer at, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I think it's beautiful from like far away too. It has everything. Yeah.
For sure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Up next, we have Emily Underwood.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I'm Emily Underwood, and I'm going to talk about a project I call Reading the Landscape of California, which are these zines that I've made. And I'm going to talk about my kind of process and history of making them. And I'm going to start with this slide right here, which is a geologic cross-section of San Francisco. And this is great because if you see in the middle, all that kind of like wavy stuff that's like Diamond Heights underneath, that's all the church that we were just talking about. And I actually grew up in San Francisco, not far from the California Academy of Sciences. And I feel like growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area had a really strong effect on my interest in geology because it is such a young and active landscape and you can see so much in it. So like when I would be at my high school out in the Richmond district is all covered underneath with sand deposits. And I would wonder, how did that sand get there? Or get off the bus and have to walk up this big hill to go to my house and wonder, why is there these steep hills? Or why is the bay there? And when I was, I guess, 8, we had the Loma Prieta earthquake. And I remember my mom was in San Francisco and my dad in Oakland and the Bay Bridge was broken. But I just showed this slide because I just think growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area had a really big influence on me thinking about active geology. And I put this together from a book by Doris Sloan. If anybody's looking for books about or more resources understanding local geology of the San Francisco Bay Area, she has a great one. It's made by that UC Press. Anyway, look out for it. Let's see. I'll go to some other inspiration I have. The name for my project, Reading the Landscape of California, I stole from May Thilgard Watts, who was a Midwestern botanist and naturalist and artist. And she wrote this wonderful book called Reading the Landscape of America that's beautifully written and also in this narrative style and is accompanied by wonderful illustrations that are kind of like sequential cartoons or drawings of the landscape that show how it evolved over time. And she was also interested in geology, but also botany and like how the landscapes that we see formed. And I always thought that I would want to make something like this about California. I'm just going to talk about some of my other inspiring naturalists and artists and writers. Maybe some of you have seen the book A State of Change, written by Heyday Press by Laura Cunningham, who's also another artist and naturalist. And she spent a lot of time, she worked as a field biologist, but also spent a lot of time imagining what California looked like in different time periods thousands of years ago and did wonderful paintings of them. Lester Roundtree was not a geologist, but a botanist, but she thought that the best way to understand the landscapes of California was to travel through them through the different seasons. And she would go and collect seeds for conservation, spent her summers in the Sierras and her springs in the desert. Hannah Hinchman, she made a book called A Trail Through Leaves, which is a lot of her drawings. And I use this book a lot in my teaching because she looks and draws the landscape on macro and micro scales and has a lot of interest in geology and landforms. And another book I love is Home Ground, which is a book that's about the language we use to describe landforms and also has wonderful illustrations in it. I'm just sharing these to show you guys my process for coming up to this project, but also books that I think are great. So I studied geology at UC Santa Cruz, and then I studied geomorphology. I did a master's degree at Oregon State University. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, geomorphology is the study of landforms and the processes that shape them. And so these are events that happen more recently, geologically speaking. So this kind of ties in to the last talk about how so much of what we see in California's landscapes are kind of recent. You know, we don't have this Jurassic material. We have stuff that is, 60 million years old and newer. And so when we're talking about geomorphology, we're talking about the Quaternary or things that have happened 2 to 6 million years ago. But the rocks that form these landscapes are rocks that have been around for millions of years. And so I'm really interested in my artwork in showing how thinking about like the geologic time scale and all the different kind of ways that we think about time, and then how that ties into the plant communities and animal communities that we see and the rapid changes that are happening today. So after I did degrees in geology, I decided I wanted to be a science communicator, and I'm a visual person. And so I did a program at Cal State Monterey Bay in science illustration. And one of the things I really wanted to explore in my illustrations I made during that time were the relationships between geology and botany. I said I was going to talk about flowers. And this actually ties into what we were talking about with the subduction zone. That was one of the coolest visualizations, the conveyor belt at the grocery store. I love that. And here's kind of like one of the ways that manifests in the landscape that we see is those serpentines, our California state rock, are these material from the deep ocean crust. And so they're concentrated in heavy minerals. And when those materials were smushed, I think they were the Oreos in the last presentation, those heavy minerals are concentrated in the soil, and only specific types of plants evolved to grow there. So they're endemic species that grow nowhere else. And this was one of my first attempts to do an illustration that showed the relationship between geology, soil, and botany. And that's kind of one of the ways I like to think about the landscape, is this interconnectedness and the kind of different time scales all manifesting at once. After I did the program at CSUMB, Cal State Monterey Bay, I did an artist residency in Joshua Tree National Park, which is another place in California that has really puzzling geology. I remember one of the first times I went there, like in high school, and looking at those rock formations that when I first got there, I just painted them endlessly. And I remember thinking that they looked like they were just like some giant hand had come and scooped rocks up and sort of dropped them in little piles. And it turns out that those rocks were actually being eroded over time in a different climate, a more wet climate that actually had forests on the surface and lots of soil formation. And when there was a wetter climate, the moisture was seeping into the cracks and joints and slowly eroding these formations so it was all happening in the subsurface. And then when the Pleistocene-Holocene transition happened and the landscape became drier, all that soil was removed and kind of exposed these landforms that were being eroded underneath the surface. And one of the animals that I came to love in the desert and all over California, but specifically the desert wood rat. Wood rats actually pass their nests on from generation to generation. And so there's actually very old material in there, and a lot of people who are dating dendrochronologists and paleoecologists use the materials from these middens to piece together what the plant compositions were like thousands of years ago. And so that's who's down in the lower right hand of the slide. And another thing that I really found fascinating about the desert is that you can see sort of the distribution of the plant communities and how they fit into the sort of like geomorphic areas. So you've got the high desert, the Joshua trees, and then alluvial fans and the Bahada, where you find like those ocotillos and teddy bear choyas. And then when you get down into the bottomlands and the canyons where their water is able to come out from the subsurface, and the faults is where you get the California fan palms. So that was a really cool experience, and I incorporated that into the zine. The next place I did a residency was the Elkhorn Slough Foundation in Monterey Bay. It's the mouth of the Monterey Bay and the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon. And it's also a really fascinating place because there's a lot of faulting that happens there. And so it's kind of like an oversized body or slough that doesn't really have, it's disconnected from its original drainage. And so it has this kind of really interesting geomorphic history. And then also it's a tidal area that used to kind of shift where it met the mouth of the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon, which is like the Grand Canyon, but it's just underwater. It's one of the deepest it's one of the deepest submarine canyons on the planet. And so you have this drainage area going to it, and like all this tidal thing, this shifting tidal environment. And then when they built Moss Landing Harbor, they made that area stationary. And so so it just kind of has a really fascinating kind of history to piece together. And you can see all the ways that this changing environment manifests in just sort of the landforms and the shapes of the slough and the marshes. Another place that's a great trip to go learn about geology is going up to Point Reyes. And if you're interested in earthquake geology and faulting, so the Tomales Bay that divides sort of Point Reyes from the mainland is actually the San Andreas Fault. So the reason that the Tomales Bay is there is because it's a sunken piece along the fault. And you also have on Point Reyes, you have two different rock types. You have the granitic, the Selenian granite that was part of the Sierras, or kind of formed at the same time, that moved up along the fault. And you have marine sediments that accumulated along the way. And they support totally different forests. On the sedimentary side, you've got Douglas forests, and on the granitic side, you have Bishop pine forests because of the soils that developed on those two different rock types. So another cool place to look at geology. And now I'm going to shift a little bit into the process of making the zines. I did another residency in Amsterdam, and I started experimenting with a machine called a risograph and making these kind of like fold up zines. And then my friend Jeff, who I think is watching right now, he makes the Bolinas Hearsay News up in Bolinas, and they print their paper 2 to 3 times a week on a risograph machine up there in Bolinas. And he let me come up and experiment making little zines so that I could do sort of geologic interpretation project. And I'm going to go just really briefly into the process of printing these, because it's very affordable color printing, but the technology is very specific. And you build these images up. The color images are built up with the colors. Each color is printed separately. So you print red on one page, you take the paper and put it back through the machine and print yellow. And then you take the color back, you take the page back and put it through the machine and print blue. And so you're building up these colors and they're mixing on the page. So it's really fun, and it has a specific aesthetic that isn't you can't really be that detailed with it, but I sort of like that constraint. As a printmaker, you kind of have to like see what happens, and so a lot of this stuff doesn't like line up perfectly, but it's sort of like it's sort of like a specific taste, but I really like using it. The first steps are, of course, doing observation and sketching and planar painting. And so the basis of all of the illustrations in there come from direct observation. And then so up there at the Bolinas Hearsay, I printed the first little fold-up zine. This is another great place to go to learn about geology down in Monterey Bay, Point Lobos. I used to live near here, so I spent a lot of time going there on geology field trips and field sketching field trips. And it's got a great history, a geologic history, because it has all these formations that were turbidite sequences, which are underwater landslides. And so it's really, really got this like dramatic layering along the coast. I don't know if you ever looked at the photos of like Edward Weston Beach. But I just wanted to experiment with showing like not just how those formed, but also some of the other processes that made the landscape what it is today. So this was my first attempt at that. So this was the geology of Point Lobos. And then the next one I did was the first volume of the reading of Landscape of California. And so this has got a lot of the stories that I just kind of went over, plus some stuff about the Sierras and the San Gabriels. And then I made another one. Oh, the first one, I did all the writing myself, which was kind of new for me. I'm not used to science writing, so it was a good exercise. And then I asked people who are better writers to contribute writing for the second volume. And I did illustrations and some cartoon sequences for that. I also, how am I doing on time? I also do some teaching. I'm just going to skip this over. And I aspire to make a third reading the Landscape of California. These are some of the places I haven't been yet. The Modoc Plateau, some volcanic areas that I would like to do. I'd like to explore the ancient Lake Tulare and the Salton Trough. I really loved that conveyor belt thing from the last presentation because I really wanted to do a geology cake where you would bake all of these textures and use sprinkles and frosting to sort of show the geology of California. I'd also love to do some sculptural animations with clay. And also one more geologic artist, Ray Troll. I didn't draw this and I never met Ray Troll, but I think he wrote this about me, this little cartoon here. And these are ways to get in touch. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much. This was lovely. Your work, first of all, stunning, beautiful. I love it. Second of all, that wood rat passing its home down generation to generation deserves a movie. I would watch that 10 out of 10. And so cool how people can like tell about biodiversity or plant biodiversity of the past from that too. So really, really cool. And we have many questions. First, you mentioned some like constraints of risograph printing. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the medium that you work in either aids or complicates or?
Well, part of the thing is, I'm going to find an example here. It's registration, and I could get better at this, but like you can see when you look closely at it, like the layers don't always line up. And so it's sort of like, there's ways to get around it. And I want to become a better printer. I just sort of feel like I get like, I have to do this thing, but like, I'd love to spend time just like really honing in and getting it looking really good. But that's the thing. It's just, it's so affordable and so fun, but it's hard to do like detail and stuff with it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And does that impact like what you choose to illustrate in, or
it impacts how I illustrate it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And how did you first decide that art was the way that you wanted to explore?
The long way. Like I started drawing a lot and then thought like I'm a really curious person and really interested in science, and then always found like myself like on geology field trips. It was always my sketchbooks were, I was always drawing a lot.
Yeah.
And using that as my way. Like on tests, I'd be like, I don't really know the answer, but I can draw this picture of it, you know? So finally doing the science illustration program at CSUMB was kind of what cemented it for me.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it seems like you're expanding into other mediums now, cakes.
Yeah, I like my art practice too, which I try to keep as loose as possible.
That's awesome. And Maricela is asking, how long does it take to make one zine?
I mean, it took months. Yeah, it took months. But then I printed it pretty quickly. So I have it all like prepared on, I have the files all prepared, and the printing I did in a weekend. But I mean, yeah, like half a year.
Yeah. Yeah. And the work, I mean, the work's beautiful. It reflects the care that you put into it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then kind of back to the geology side of things, but have people impacted the geomorphology of California at all?
Certainly, and that's something that I think about a lot. Like in San Francisco Bay, for instance,
Mhm.
it's like in the Pleistocene, there was no San Francisco Bay, and I love to think about this time in this moment when the sea level came up pretty rapidly at that transition, and all of a sudden there was this like estuarine system with like shellfish and plentiful seafood, and a lot of people came to live there, and still are, and just the ways that the landscape was stewarded or altered in order to meet the needs of the people living there is definitely like the most recent part of the geologic record, when we're thinking about the history of California going back to millions of years. So this is probably what, 15,000 years into now that people, and today, I mean, changes are happening so fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I loved that slide, or all of the slides, but especially that first one with the wildflowers of California and that serpentine. Like that is just so cool how things specifically grow in the places created by how geology changes over time. And do you have a like a most fascinating, most interesting geology life interaction that comes to mind?
Oh,
Your favorite? I'm gonna make you.
I mean, I know it's like I didn't go to Yosemite until I was an adult, but like there was a few years back that was like this really, really rainy year, or there was tons of snow and it melted all at once. It was probably like 2018, I guess, or 19. But I did a quick painting trip to Yosemite and stood under Bridal Veil Falls. And it was just like so much water. It was like I never felt so moved. It was just incredible. But yeah, Yosemite.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Absolutely. Maricela also says, I would totally sign up to taste test the California geology cake, which, if so,
Yeah.
just add me to the list.
Cool.
Love that. Love that. And then one final question for you. Where can we find your work? Where can we purchase your work? Where can we support?
I have a website, and it was on the last slide of that. I could put it in the chat, underwoodillustration.com. And also that email address is a great one for me.
Yes. Okay. Fantastic. That sounds
Just get
great.
in touch.
Yeah, I will be
Thank you.
finding your website. But yeah, everybody, here's where you can contact Emily. And thank you so much for joining us. This was lovely.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next talk.
Yes, we are going to move on to the next talk, which will be Riley. Thanks.
Hello, thank you all for having me, and what great talks to follow. All right, so I will be sharing about the vibration of rock arches and towers in Utah. Before I start sharing about it, I have found that I enjoy asking audiences questions before I start talking. So if you want to utilize the comment section to answer one or both of these questions, please feel free. I find that, when we get a large group of people together, there's a wealth of knowledge and different opinions as well. So the first question is, what do you know about landforms? And if you were sleeping during Emily's talk, landforms are natural features on the Earth's surface, and that includes mountains, canyons, arches, etc. You can write anything that you've learned from formal education, or on your own, or from your family, or from culture. And the second question is, what, if any, responsibility do you think we humans have in interacting with the natural environment? So feel free to add anything to the comments there. I'll pause for a couple seconds before moving on. And feel free to, learn from each other, and I will, of course, come back to visit these comments later. Alrighty. What I have been learning about for the last 5 years or so is about how rock arches and towers are constantly vibrating. So because landforms are attached to the surface of the Earth, there is energy within the Earth constantly, and this energy comes from seismic activity, and there's also energy surrounding the Earth. And that energy can come from wind, it can come from human activity, it can come from oceans crashing on the surface of the Earth, and that energy provides a way for these things that are attached to the Earth to vibrate. And so in Utah, we have thousands of rock arches and towers, and they're very often slender and prominent forms, and they're constantly vibrating due to this energy. We can't, as humans, detect the vibrations with our eyes or with our hands, but we're able to use special instruments to measure these vibrations. And here I've got 2 animations up for Arsenic Arch on the left of the screen and Eagle Plume Tower on the right-hand side of the screen, showing exaggerated motions of the vibration. So of course, like I said, we can't see these vibrations, and they're exaggerations, but it gives you a good idea for how these seemingly very still landforms are constantly vibrating every single second of every single day of the entire year of its lifespan. So the way that we know that these landforms are vibrating is we use specialized instruments called seismometers, and seismometers can measure very small changes in motion. They're often used for understanding ground motion during earthquakes, and what we do is that we try to access the highest point on a tower that we can, or the furthest point out on an arch span that we can get to, and simply just place the seismometer on the bedrock, or on the solid rock surface of the arch or the tower. And we don't drill any holes. We don't damage the surface of the landform. It's a very non-invasive method of collecting data, and we stick sometimes a bucket on top so the seismometer is less affected by wind, and then we walk away, and the seismometer collects the vibration data for however long we leave it there. Sometimes it's as short as 30 minutes to an hour. Sometimes we leave the seismometer overnight, and in a few cases we've actually been able to leave a seismometer on a landform for about a year to get really long-term continuous vibration data of the features. So when we come back and collect the data from the seismometer, this is kind of what it looks like. This is Barrett Arch, which is a beautiful arch outside of Moab, Utah. And this top panel shows the vertical vibration velocity of the arch, so how it's moving up and down. That's on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. So this is 6 hours of the arch's vertical vibration velocity. And on this bottom panel is the same data, but in frequency mode. And so we've deconstructed the vibrations, the vibration velocity, and put it into a way that we can see the frequency that the arch is vibrating at. And you can kind of think of an arch or a tower like a guitar string. If you pluck the guitar string, it will vibrate back and forth at a certain frequency, and that frequency we're able to hear in the form of sound, or what tone it's resonating at. And so kind of in the same way, the Earth is constantly plucking arches and towers, and so they're constantly vibrating at certain frequencies that are dependent upon things like material properties and its geometry. And so what this bottom panel is looking at the frequency on the y-axis over time, and the bands that go all the way across horizontally are like red and orange. Those are the natural frequencies that this arch is vibrating at. And so one of the really neat things we can do with this data is that we can speed it up, and it can become something that is audible, that humans can hear. And again, this isn't sound that's being produced by the arch or the tower. It just happens to be, we're able to take vibration data and speed it up so it becomes effectively sound that we can hear. And one of the really neat things about Barrett Arch is the 2 lowest frequencies that it's vibrating at when sped up 100 times end up being about an A and a C note. So the vibrations that it creates is really, I think, quite pleasant to listen to. So I'm going to play a few seconds of vibration data. And if you want to, again, use the comments to say maybe what it makes you think of, or what you're reminded of by, or maybe even how it makes you feel, please feel free to add that in the comments. Some people find it really relaxing to listen to. Some people are a little bit more spooked out by these tones. But another type of data that we collect in the field are photos, and we make 3D models of arches and towers using these photos. And this helps us understand the entire motion of the arch, because usually we just have one seismometer, and so we only know where or how the arch or tower is moving in that one place where we've placed the seismometer. And by using different programs, we're able to have a better idea of how the arch is vibrating in its entirety. And those animations that I showed at the beginning were a good way of us to be able to see that. And we have made our photogrammetry models here available online. And so if you want to come back and visit this URL, you'll be able to look at the 3D models of the arches and towers that we have online. And some of them are even downloadable. You're able to like move around and see what they look like, and they're pretty neat. And our research group has been able to record dozens of arches and towers over the years, and we have been able to speed up the data that we have. And there's again here 2 websites that you can visit to click on the arch and listen to the vibrations of the arch, or visit the other website and hear some of the tower vibrations. And each one of these landforms, they're different. They have a different geometry, made up of a different material, and so the tones that they that we hear when we speed up their natural vibrations are all very different and very special and unique. You might be thinking, does any of this matter? Like, is this just a fun fact that I can add to my bank of fun facts in my brain? Yes, and also there is some greater reasons behind why we're doing this research. In Utah and in other parts of the world, rock arches and towers are culturally valuable. There are thousands of them. We have an entire national park dedicated to arches. Millions of tourists come to visit our state every year to see these landforms, and many of them are sacred to different Native American populations in the Four Corners region. They don't have an infinite lifespan, so arches and towers form and collapse through erosion and weathering, and with the possibility of collapse also comes with an associated hazard to humans. And one thing that I have been specifically studying in my own research is how human created energy sources affect the structural health and integrity of these landforms. And one of the key ideas that helps understand how human energy sources can cause damage to arches or towers is resonance. And the family-friendly version of resonance and how I think of this is like a swing. So if you have a swing, just like an arch or tower, there will be natural frequency that the swing swings back and forth at. And if you want the swing to go higher and higher, you're going to time your pushes to match the frequency of that swing system. And if you match that frequency, then of course the swing, or in this case, the dog, will go higher and higher. And in the same sort of way, I've been looking at different sources of energy that humans create and the frequencies of those energies, and if those align with the natural frequencies of arches and towers, how that causes the vibration amplitudes to increase and what that means for crack growth and therefore structural degradation of these landforms. Some of the sources of energy that I've been looking at are helicopters, trains, highways, induced earthquakes, and of course, there's so much more. This middle, or this map on in the middle here shows the seismic activity in southeastern Utah. These orange circles are earthquakes, and the black dots are all the documented arches. And there's that cluster just over the border in Colorado, and those are all induced earthquakes. So those are caused by human activity, injecting wastewater into the surface or into the earth, and it causes earthquakes that aren't typically of a certain of that magnitude for this area. And then to the right, there's a few different helicopters, and helicopters produced low frequency sound energy called infrasound. And we can't hear it as humans, but it has the possibility of aligning with natural frequencies of arches and towers and therefore causing them to vibrate at greater amplitudes than they normally do. And of course, helicopters can pretty much go anywhere. So the reach of their infrasound is almost unlimited. So this is back to arsenic arch, and we listened to the vibrations sped up a Brett arch earlier, and this arch has a natural frequency that coincides with one of the frequencies of noise emitted by a two-blade helicopter. And maybe you liked the sound that you heard before. This is, I think, a little bit more jarring. So these are the vibrations of arsenic arch sped up, but during a helicopter flight. And we will just listen to that together. And feel free again to utilize the comments to add any thoughts or feelings. So yeah, quite a bit different than that first recording we listened to. And this is another arch that vibrates at a frequency that aligns with the lowest frequency emitted by a two-blade helicopter that's very common. And here's the sped up vibrations of this one during a common tourist helicopter flight over Bryce Canyon National Park. Whoops. So our key findings in terms of human impacts on arches is that helicopters, earthquakes, and other large vibrations have a minor but distinct effect on crack growth in arches. So maybe this is less of a fun fact to end on, but this goes kind of back to that second question I asked, and that if you think that humans have a responsibility in interacting and how we interact with the natural environment, here's another thing to add. We of course know some of the very obvious ways that humans impact the natural landscape, but there's also some other ways that we might not even be realizing that we're impacting the evolution of the natural landscape. So thank you for having me. I am just one member of a much larger research group, but I was really happy to be able to come here and share.
Thank you so much, Riley. That was like a whole new world. Like I had no idea that these structures that I think of as just kind of like really like permanent, like solid, unmoving things are so dynamic and have so much going on. Wow. So we have a couple of really great questions in the comments. I would like to encourage everyone to keep on putting questions as we start asking. Let's see. So how do you produce the 3D models of some of these arches and towers? Do you have to scan an entire rock formation?
So we don't scan. I guess in a way we scan with a camera. So often we either use cameras from the ground or in a drone, or sometimes on a 24-foot selfie stick, and walk or fly all the way around the landform, taking pictures. And then we use a program to stitch together all the photos, and it makes a 3D model. And then we clean up the model in another program, and then we import it into another program and add various things like material properties, and then it uses some equations, and it then predicts the ways that the arch is vibrating, and that's how we get those animations.
Oh, awesome. So you mentioned like helicopters, trains, highways as some of these sources of the sound that can impact these formations. Can things even smaller than that have an impact? Like Navman wants to know about lawnmowers, or what it feels like what are we doing that directly that's impacting?
Yeah, I think that energy sources. So we're very much looking at airborne sound, like from helicopters, or ground-borne vibrations from like trains, and so I think that lawnmowers are probably not super common out in the desert, and they're also quite small in terms of mass, and so trains are ginormous, and they're who knows how many tons they are, really cause the ground to vibrate, and lawnmowers probably aren't going to be the thing causing arches to collapse.
Okay, that might bring some solace to our audience. Let's see. Blair wants to know if there's any evidence that groundwater extraction can affect the structural health of arches.
Mm, I am no expert in groundwater extraction, but I mean, I also am not really aware of how much is being extracted in southeastern Utah, but definitely, I mean, we know that it can cause, the surface of the earth to sag, and if I could imagine, groundwater is being extracted near arches, and that affects the surface that the arch is part of, that will have an impact on the stress distribution within the arch itself.
Yeah, I'm sure. Um, what you mentioned that these arches and these towers have lifespans. You even showed us that rainbow arch that did collapse relatively recently. Um, can you predict the lifespan of these arches? And can you predict if or when they are about to collapse?
So we haven't yet like we actually didn't record the collapse of Rainbow Arch. It happened during the winter a few years ago. There's some ideas that we could be able to use frequency tracking to see if there's going to be like an impending collapse. So that's been used before with landslides, seeing when a rock or landmass will fail. So there's the possibility of that being used. No one that we know of has actually been able to do that. Um, of course, Rainbow Arch, the one that collapsed, and I guess to be really clear, it's not Rainbow Bridge and Rainbow Bridge National Monument. Rainbow Arch is about a 5 meter long arch. It's very small. That had a massive crack running through the underside, and so like we knew that, okay, like there's a really big indicator that maybe this is going to collapse soon. But there's also tons of arches that have huge cracks in them that haven't collapsed, that like at least in the time that we've been observing. So hard
Yeah,
hard to answer that.
I'm sure. And I'm sure that the time that we've been observing is but like a tiny speck in the lifespans of these formations. But Maricela, kind of in that vein, wants to know how far back does this research go? When were these vibrations first discovered, and when did we start recording them?
I don't know. I know my advisor, I don't know, maybe like a decade ago, had been using seismometers to measure the vibrations of landslides, and then came to Utah and was like, maybe I should stick it on an arch. So I'm not so sure. I'm just a PhD student. I'm not so sure if like people, I really I don't know how much further back arch vibration measurements go besides our research group. I'm so sorry.
Don't sweat it. We appreciate your expertise regardless. When putting a seismometer on an arch, how delicate do you have to be?
Yeah,
How do you get it up there?
sometimes, sometimes it involves, just, like, walking up to the arch, and then if it's at, like, eye level, you can just place it on there. So especially for some of the small arches, we don't like go on top of the arch. Some of the arches are, tens of meters long and wide, and there's some great photos of cars driving across Mesa Arch, or sorry, cars driving across Watch. What's it called? Oh, Musselman Arch and Canyonlands, before the superintendent put a stop to that. So in those cases, like a human being, a few hundred pounds, is probably not going to do a lot in terms of affecting the arch. But we try to walk out, place it, and then leave.
Okay. Do you know of any research like this, or have you yourself done any research like this on any landform or any rock formations in California? Or is your research just in Utah?
We've mostly been Utah, but actually last October, 1 year ago, like 1 year and a week ago, I came out with a group of undergraduate students, and we measured the vibrations of, not the best name, but Indian Rock Arch in Yosemite National Park. And it's the only documented arch in Yosemite and one of 5 documented in the Sierra Nevada range. So there's very few arches, at least, I mean, there's lots of sea arches, but in terms of in the Sierra Nevadas. So we came out, and we got a permit to go to Yosemite National Park and measure those vibrations.
Oh, interesting. And then I don't want to speak for anyone in our audience, but I myself am not a formally educated geologist. Is there anything that the layperson can do to help protect the integrity of these rock formations?
Yeah, I think,
Like not flying helicopters?
I think each person might come up with a different way or different connection they have to the landforms. I think one of the simplest things is to know that they're not static. They are moving. They're dynamic. Like you said at the beginning, like we don't often think that this landscape is in motion, but it is, and that knowing that we do have an impact in how we interact with the landscape. And then also, I mean, there's like ways to get involved in different levels. I mean, you can participate in like environmental groups. You can give public comments to your national parks when they're asking for input on how helicopters fly over them, or what types of visitor traffic they want. I mean, there's lots of different ways that someone can
Yeah,
take action.
definitely. Well, thank you so much. Also, just thank you to everyone in our audience who has left such thoughtful comments in response to Riley's questions. There's some
Thank you.
really
Yes, I will go
beautiful
back and
comments
look
there. Yes, but Riley, yeah, this research is fascinating. I just so appreciate you taking the time to be here with us tonight.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Of course.
Hi.
Hello, Aria. Thank you so much to Maricela, Emily, and Riley for those amazing presentations. They truly, okay, I was about to say it. They truly, but I'm not going to. It's too cliche. What I mean to say is that they were great. I really enjoyed them, and it has been a lovely night.
Entirely agree. All gems. Coming to you. Night School comes to you the first and third Thursdays of every single month. And our next program is ephemeral ecosystems. And by that, we mean we'll be looking at the many temporary habitats that pop up across the world or sink down whale fall, as Maricela mentioned in her talk earlier. And these habitats support some really amazing organisms until they inevitably and kind of poetically, in a lot of cases, fade away. And it's pretty magical, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I'm sure that night will also rock. As always, subscribe to the California Academy of Sciences on YouTube. The button should be right there, so you'll be notified every time the night school is in session. Recordings of every night school stay up on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, so feel free, please, to rewatch our our old episodes. They're all there. There's hours and hours and hours of phenomenal talks, just like the ones we received tonight. There's a lot of great stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Take
That
care.
concludes our night.
Have a good night.
Night.
Next time.